Imperial yeast is at it again with their Imperialis project, creating yet another unique proprietary strain through hybridization. In addition to its excellent attenuation and rapid reduction of diacetyl, I-10 Mangostini contributes robust ripe tropical fruit, strawberry, and lychee notes that complement modern hops. And as a Kvike hybrid, it can be fermented anywhere from 78 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 to 32 degrees Celsius without any negative issues. Head over to imperialyeast.com to learn more about I-10 Mangostini and be sure to pick some up for your next batch of fruity IPA. Welcome to the Brew Lab. It's kind of tropey to say that beer is a thousands-of-year-old beverage, but it's true. It's been brewed forever. Some things are still the same, and some things are totally different now. Technology's had an impact, new styles, new science, all making great beer better. For someone that's been answering reader questions for 30 years, Ashton Lewis has probably forgotten more than I've actually learned. I'm your host, Cade Job, and today I'm back in the lab with my co-host, Jordan Folks, as we talk about takeaways from last week's episode, what Mr. Wizard has learned over 30 years.
I mean, in homebrewing alone, the change has been pretty vast, and that column in BYO Magazine has always been a great source of information for those that are trying to figure out something they don't necessarily know. But gosh, I have to imagine that the questions that are being asked now are fundamentally different than they were 30 years ago.
Yeah, right. And I would have thought the same, of course. I mean, Ashton Lewis is, of course, by way of introduction, Mr. Wizard, who's been writing the Help Me Mr. Wizard column in Brew Your Own magazine since the early 1990s. And in that column, he answers reader questions about any brewing related topic. He said, says from grain to glass. And yeah, it's interesting to talk to him because that's what I would have thought too, that all of the questions would be so wildly different. And he, of course, said, yeah, some of the questions are different, but a lot of it is the same. So I'm really excited to talk about those things with you this week. And of course, I was really excited to talk to him last week to see what he'd learned over 30 years. Jordan, you and I haven't been brewing quite 30 years, maybe collectively 30 years. But anyway, this week we wanted to talk about the things that Mr. Wizard learned, like the influence of technology, the things that commercial brewers can learn from home brewers, the art versus the science of beer, and of course, the things that kept Mr. Wizard interested after a long career. We'll also talk about those same things for us. We'll talk about what we think has changed over our brewing careers and also the things that keep us interested. If you're not already a patron of Brülosophy, why not? If you support us as a patron, you get access to awesome rewards like unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session. Becoming a patron is easy. There's no obligation. You can cancel anytime. But if you're out there listening to this show and consuming all the other free content that's available to you through Brülosophy, and you've been thinking, I really should throw them a few bucks a month, yeah, now's the time. The great thing about podcasts is you can pause them and come back whenever. So please take a minute, pause the show, and head over to patreon.com/Brülosophy to sign up. I've said it before, I love all of our followers at Brülosophy. We've got such an active group of commenters on the website and YouTube channel, people who email in feedback, and folks who share and discuss our results. It's rewarding and humbling to hear from you all, so I just wanted to say thank you for engaging with us, and I love you. If you haven't yet left us a comment or a review or sent in an email, I'd love to hear from you. Shoot me an email, cade@brülosophy.com, or leave a comment or a review of the show wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. All right, feedback this week comes from Ken, who writes in. He says, hey, good episode on some of the other dry hop options out there. And I think he was referring to episode 165, dry hop reduction methods. He says, definitely like the addition of the Applying the Science episodes with Jordan. Jordan mentioned using Spectrum before, and I was wondering what dosing rates he used. I'm looking into using Spectrum in an upcoming hoppy saison, but don't want to overdo it or underdo it. Plan was to use a 20-gram pack in a 6-gallon batch fermentation. Cheers.
This is a great question. So I had the same question, and I had noticed that it has been pretty intense when using an entire packet, which is a 20-gram packet, in a 5-gallon batch. And so when I asked someone at John I. Haas, they told me their recommendation is up to a 0.5 gram per liter, and only up to 50% of the total dry hop load. So that means the other 50% of your dry hops should be, pellets, whole cones, etc. And they also mentioned that you want to have some yeast in suspension still. So for a home brewer, I wouldn't be too worried about the yeast because you're probably not like plate filtering before you're dosing it with your Spectrum. But by my math, that means that a half of those 20-gram homebrew packets for Spectrum is about all you would want for a full 5-gallon keg. You definitely can use the whole thing, but just it might need a little bit of extra lagering time, or just be prepared for a super potent impact if you're going to use the whole thing in just 5 gallons.
Ooh, yeah, that's a really interesting one. I've never actually brewed with Spectrum. You know more than me, so I defer to you about this. But are there, if you're going to use just half of it, are there any ways that you should, save the other half, or like how would you go about that?
That's a good question, and something that I've been racking my brain around. I think that might be possible to vacuum seal it. I'm sure there are people that are just folding it up and putting it back in the fridge. That would not be my preference. So maybe if you could, brew 10 gallons and split it in half, or plan your brew day so you have some sort of other application to have it, or try vacuum sealing would be my suggestion.
Okay, nice. Well, okay, well, Ken, I hope that answers your question. And of course, Jordan knows more than me, so I'll defer to him on this. And good luck with your brew. Let us know how it goes. After this short break, we'll talk about our takeaways from my conversation with Ashton Lewis, also known as Mr. Wizard. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brülosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals.
That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken experts since 1990. Chicken taco experts since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
Talking with Mr. Wizard was a fun experience. Meeting someone who you've been reading for years is a little surreal, and he's such a genuine and humble guy. Jordan, have you read Help Me, Mr. Wizard in BYO magazine?
I have. Yeah, I love that column, and it's always interesting to kind of check in where the pulse is in the given moment. But like you mentioned earlier, as much as things change, some things just stay the same. And, it seems like we've had some of the same questions for the last 30 years.
Yeah, some of them certainly have stayed the same, and certainly some of the same questions as Ashton mentioned in the show. But yeah, this was one of those columns that I, back whenever you and I started homebrewing, there was more information than when Ashton started homebrewing. He started homebrewing in the early 90s. I was in the early 2010s, and you were probably in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, something like that. I'll let you answer. But when I started homebrewing, everything was written, like it was magazines. There was a little bit of online stuff that was there, but that was mainly through like forums. And there was no, like, John Palmer had written a book, Charlie Papazian had written a book, but there was no like authority out there that was like just answering questions, right? Like, here, take my question and answer it as an authority. And I found that in BYO magazine, which was cool. By the way, BYO magazine, I haven't read it in a couple years, but at least a couple years back, it was a fantastic magazine. So if you'd like more homebrewing content, that's a great way to find it. But the key feature of the BYO magazine for me was that Help Me Mr. Wizard column. I mean, that's always the first place that I turned whenever I opened up, and the things that I read. It's written well, and it's questions from homebrewers, right? It's things that people want to know. I mean, there's also commercial brewer questions there, but it's questions about all kinds of beer-related things. So I asked Ashton how things have changed and how they stayed the same, and I thought, we'd kind of go through and add our thoughts to what he said, and then kind of add some of our own ideas. But first, before we get there, is that where you started? I mean, how long ago did you start brewing, Jordan, and where were you getting your information?
I started circa 2012 or so. And, back then, for me, it was really all about books. So the yeast book, the water book, things like that. But then not that long after I joined the AHA, so I started getting Zymergy magazine, and my obsession with brewing literature has expanded to the point where at this point I think I'm getting pretty much all of them sent to my house, including BYO, and it's a great one. I love Mr. Wizard. Detail is insane how far he will go in answering these reader questions and going down all these hypothetical rabbit holes. I also really love the style column by Gordon Strong, where he kind of gives you a deep dive into a specific style, and then provides an example recipe. So those are probably my two favorite reoccurring articles in that magazine.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, every article has a different theme, and so there's always, new things that are going on in the articles. But yeah, I love that. Ashton goes into an amazing amount of detail, and he really cares about answering the reader questions, right? One of the things that I always get frustrated about is whenever someone asks a question and then the response is, well, I understand your question, but I'm going to answer a different question, right? and I don't feel like Ashton's ever done that in those columns, which is great. But he has learned some things over the years, and so I thought maybe we'd go through, starting off, maybe the things that haven't changed according to Mr. Wizard. So one of the things that he was talking about was how mash, boil, and fermentations are still basically the same as they were 30 years ago. We've done, how many times have we done an experiment saying a 30-minute mash versus a 60-minute mash maybe isn't significant, or a 45-minute boil versus a 60-minute boil isn't significant, or fermentation with oxygenation and fresh yeast pitch doesn't make a difference, right? But we're still doing these things. So how that one I thought was that was really cool to talk about. Those things really don't seem like they've changed all that much.
Except maybe the technologies in which we do them, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Now that we have the all-in-one systems and the fancy, RO systems at home, and Brew and Water and Brewfather and all of these software pieces to help us put it together. Although they might have still been boiling for 60 minutes, back 30 years ago. Not to mention the ingredients that we're using now in our 60-minute boils, right? We're not just ripping a pack of yeast off of the bottom of a can and pouring in pre-hopped wort into water. We're doing full mashes with the freshest hops available, and yada, yada, yada. It's pretty incredible the amount of technology ingredients that we have at our fingertips, even if the fundamentals of single infusion mash, 60-minute boil, fermentation are, somewhat similar to what they were a couple decades ago.
Yeah, and it's the basic processes, right, are the same. I mean, the one thing that I'll spend a little bit of time talking about, that 60-minute single infusion mash, right? As we've talked about on the show, right, we're learning that more things are happening during that protein rest, like fan, that's helping maybe shelf stability as you go down or go later on. We've talked about haze stability, or haze, brewing clear beer as being something that's impacted at lower temperatures, and of course the different enzymes that are active, like beta and alpha amylase, right? We think about if I want a really fermentable wort, I reduce my mash temperature to 147, 148, 147, 150, something like that. So 62, 63, 60 Celsius, something around that range. And if I want a less fermentable wort, then I go up at 65 or 70 Celsius, or 154, Fahrenheit. And those things are dogma still. People still brew that. I mean, raise your hand or nod along if you still brew a 60-minute mash at a single infusion temperature. I mean, I think a lot of people are still doing that, even though there's been some science even before the last 30 years that suggested maybe we should be doing things like ramping up a protein rest like you do when you're brewing lagers, right, Jordan?
Yeah, and I think that with the advent of all-in-ones, the proclivity to step mash at the homebrew level has increased, and there seems to be probably a little bit more doing that, because I don't know about you, but when I was using an igloo cooler where you're, dumping your preheated strike water into it and stuff like that, step mashes were so annoying and were so stressful of missing or hitting the temperatures and all the extra water additions, and so it's just so much easier now.
No, totally. Yeah, that's 100%. And I would totally agree with you too. If I was looking at things that have changed over the years, technology, right? Holy moly. I mean, even like you, I started brewing sometime around 2012. And so what's that? Oh my gosh, we've been brewing for over 12 years at this point. In any event, the technology is wildly different. Like you, I started with an igloo cooler, right? And I think a lot of people were brewing in igloo coolers as your mash tun, and that does a great beer. I still know people that are brewing in the igloo coolers, but certainly there's been a trend towards the technology. And I'm brewing on the Brülosophy systems. You're brewing on is it Clawhammer that you're brewing on?
That's right.
Yeah. And so those have, recirculating pumps in it that run, the wort and keep the temperature at a consistent level. So you are able to do things like a step mash. You are able to take advantage of that protein rest. And how many times, like we just recently were talking about, right, in the low dough and fan episodes, about how like low oxygen brewing may be tied to low fan brewing and might improve shelf stability. And those things are aided by that technology, which I think is really cool. But still, people are just brewing a single infusion mash. It's easy, right? I think that's one of the main things. It's easy to do. Like you said, you just hit one temperature, it goes in, and you just let it sit for 60 minutes until starch is fully converted, and then you transfer it out. I mean, I think that's a really easy way to brew. And when brew day takes 6, 7, 8 hours, you don't really want to spend every 5 minutes nursing the temperature of your beer.
Right, and we've done a lot of experiments looking at step mashes versus single infusion, and I don't think that we've been able to prove that in a single data point that tasters could reliably tell the difference. I recently, a few months ago, published a decoction experiment that was comparing a double decoction and a Czech dark lager versus a step mash, and actually tasters could tell the difference on that. So maybe not all mash approaches are created equal, but I think that the single infusion, you really can't go wrong. I'm just the crazy person that continues to do these step mashes for my European lagers, but who knows if I'm actually getting enough of a meaningful difference to justify the extra time. But that's the beauty of these all-in-ones, is it's so easy. You just hit a button and go. So why not?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that you're the crazy person. You're the person that seems to be like listening to what the science says, right? I mean, it seems like the science keeps pointing in this direction, that the decoction adds something, that the step mash changes the protein profile of the wort, and it changes the flavor of the beer. So that's what the science keeps telling us. But yeah, you're right. I mean, we have all these experiments that just show like, hey, single infusion versus step mash didn't seem to matter much. Although I'm wondering if we did a stability one, if we let them sit for a month or 2 months or 3 months or something, if we would start to see a difference in shelf stability. But in any event, that's, one example of the mash, and of course he's talking about boiling. The other thing that I was thinking about, and Ashton didn't mention this specifically in the show, he did mention, that fermentations are still sort of being conducted in the same way. And I'm speculating, but what I think he meant was like, we're still oxygenating even fresh pitches, right? We're still adding nutrient for the most part. People add nutrient. We're fermenting at a single temperature, single ale temperature, and a single lager temperature across all of our strains, right? You're not using a different lager temperature for different strains of yeast, as long as it's lager versus ale, right? Those are clearly different. And then also just a single strain of yeast, no mixed pitches. I think of the single strain of yeast thing as like Kveik, right? Like Kveik was this yeast that kind of burst on the scene 5 years ago, and it was like, hey, you can finally ferment at like super high or non-controlled temperatures, and you make a fresh, clean beer with these Kveik strains. But Kveik was always a mixed pitch. It was never one single batch of yeast, but somehow we isolated, individual Kveik strains and started pitching those as single pitches. But it never really caught on to do mixed pitches.
Yeah, and that's probably a laboratory, limitation, right? That how difficult it would be to maintain the pure ratios from these farmhouse, pitches that have been preserved for hundreds of years via like drying it on a piece of paper or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a good point. That fermentation is probably the same too, but they weren't talking about Kveik, 30 years ago. But that being said, is again, the ingredients that we have access to are so much more varied and higher quality. A lot of the concerns that were kind of the older school concerns around fermentation, some have argued aren't as big of a deal anymore because the yeast is of so much higher quality relative to 30 years ago. As someone that's only been brewing for a little bit over a decade, I don't know what the quality of yeast was like 30 years ago, because for me, it seems that it's been fairly similarly the same since I started. It's certainly the best it's ever been now, though.
Yeah, the quality for sure. I don't think although I will say, like back in 2012 with some of the White Lab strains that were being brewed, there were it seemed like some quality issues with some of those that I brewed with. I don't know if that's the same now because I brew almost exclusively with Imperial since starting Brülosophy, right? I don't brew with other strains very often these days, and I'm very happy with Imperial's quality. But the quality may or may not have changed, but there's definitely, like you said, more variety of yeast, right? We've got these Kveik strains, we've got new GMO strains, we've got, you've even got Chico, which has now been GMO'd to not have, diacetyl or to not have haze causing or any of these other components, which is really cool to think like, okay, Chico, which has been GMO'd to add thiol release, either light thiol or super thiols, which is super cool. And that's certainly has changed. But one of the other things that I thought was really cool that Mr. Wizard talked about is that, this isn't necessarily a how things have changed, but that there are similar issues between commercial brewers and home brewers, right? As we sit here talking about, like, should you use a single infusion mash? How should you ferment? Should you oxygenate? Should you add nutrients? Should you ferment at a single temperature? Should you do mixed pitches? What yeast to use? All that stuff. That's still the same, right? Brewers have been asking those questions for 1,000 years, and they're probably going to continue asking those questions in the future. And those questions are the same between commercial brewers and home brewers. There's some technology and scale differences, of course, as Ashton mentioned, but those questions are still like fundamentally the same.
Yeah, it seems that the commercial brewer might have either a technology specific question, like home brewers don't have questions about centrifuges, or maybe some sort of really in-depth, scientific chemistry type question that the average home brewer isn't just diving as deep into. Yeah, for sure. Exactly. But those questions are going to be more about scale or technology, right? I mean, because if you were asking a question, even if it was super technical, right? If you were asking about like fan stability during the protein rest or something, like some of the questions we've asked on the Brew Lab, some of those are super technical. The takeaways from those are still applicable to home brewers, and it's interesting too. One of the comments that Ashton made that I thought was really cool was, home brewers are often looking at commercial brewers for like how to brew and like what are the best practices and stuff, but big brewers also need home brewer creativity. And he pointed to like Sierra Nevada, and he pointed to like, the changes that big brewers see, the new styles that we're brewing now, hazy IPAs. I mean, Budweiser and Miller and Coors, they all own brands now that brew almost exclusively IPAs. I mean, it's a big piece of the market share, and that's because of home brewer creativity that those beers came back. Well, and I would probably argue that the entire craft beer movement, the proliferation of IPAs to smoothie sours or whatever ungodly thing that we've cooked up, is because of home brewers. 99% of craft brewers these days started as home brewers, and so we're really the ones that have pushed this industry to where it is today.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that is funny. You bring up like the milkshake stouts or whatever, or the pastry stouts. And that was one of the things that Mr. Wizard talked about had changed, right? Is all the crazy stuff we now put into beer. I mentioned like the milkshake IPAs, and he was talking about like donut stouts and stuff, and I'm like, yeah, okay. Yeah, that's true. Just like literally putting a donut in the mash tun. That's something I don't think they would have done in the early 90s, but that's kind of cool. But one of the biggest things that he talked about this change, and I think this is very clear from our conversations, Jordan, is the usage of hops, right? I mean, hops were not being used in the 90s and early 2000s the way they are today.
Right, and not to mention the forms that they come in, right?
Yeah,
I guess they probably would have had like isomerized oil or something like that for bittering additions.
Like well, I mean, I guess it's an oil, but yeah, pre-isomerized, either pre-isomerized hops themselves, or like some sort of like Tetra or Row or ISO or some sort of like hop extract that's just the bittering components of beer. Yeah, they had some of that stuff for like light stability and everything, but that was mostly because you're brewing bitter lagers, right? Like you're brewing things that need to be light stable, and also the bitterness is the only important aspect of it. The aroma, hop aroma, is kind of like tangential. I mean, you taste a Miller Lite, a Bud Light, or a Coors Light, there's an estery component to it. There's like a little slight fruitiness there, but there's no hop aroma, at least as far as I'm aware of.
Right. And I've heard, stories of back in the day that varieties like Cascade or whatever that were developed were sent to the big brewers and were turned away because they were too aromatic.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you look at like Centennial, right, which is supposed to be super Cascade, right? And it was supposed to be like, super bitter and all that stuff. But Centennial is a great dry hopping hop too that people use all the time for its aroma. So it's like this dual purpose. But then you get into these things, Citra, right, and Mosaic. I had totally forgotten Citra's not even 15 years old, right? I mean, that was crazy for me to think about. Like, oh wow, like I can't believe Citra's actually that young. It seems like the hop that we've been brewing with for years and years, but it's a relatively new hop. So not only do we have like, new hops that we're doing, but we're also adding crazy amounts. I mean, you're adding crazy amounts in your beers, like 10 ounces in a dry hop IPA or something like that. And Ashton made that funny joke. He's like, in the 90s, if somebody said I'm adding a pound per barrel of hops into my beer, they would have chuckled and been like, what are you making? Like hop soup or hop tea or something. And now it's like a pound per barrel. It's like, do you even use hops? Right?
Right. Yeah. The usage of hops has got to have gone up. And I imagine that that's had an impact on the production of hops, right? That they're growing more to support the increased use.
Yeah, I mean, although we are in a hop slump right now, for sure, but yeah, I mean, if you look at from like, let's say 2008, that's a year that I have in my brain, because that's the year that the total acreage planted flipped from bittering hops to aroma hops, and that's sort of when aroma hops took off. So more aroma hops were being produced after 2008, and yeah, that you need more hops to get that aroma into beer. We talked about it with the gas hopper episode, right? A lot of these hoppy flavor compounds are not as soluble in beer as we would like them to be. So you need to add huge amounts of hops in order to get some of those compounds to actually solubilize and get into the beer. And that requires copious amounts of hops. But we are in a pretty big hop slump. I read a sort of scary statistic over the summer. I think it was from the Brewers Association, but it said essentially there's 2 years of the current hop need sitting in warehouses right now for brewers.
So we have too much of a surplus.
We have a huge surplus. We've essentially like a 2-year surplus. Now, it's not uncommon for industries to have like a 6 months, year, even year and a half surplus, depending on how fast things go and how quickly you need stuff, and how quickly the hops change. Right? If the hops are going sour, you need a pretty good surplus in order to continue to keep up with production. But in this case, yeah, we just got two years. We've got too much of hops sitting around. So you look at like, I think it was John I. Haas told all of their growers, you need to pull out, 10% of your Citra fields, not just not string them. I mean, like rip out the fields, right? Rip the plants out of the field. And interestingly too, if you look at 2023 numbers, this is 2023, not 2024, but there were fewer acres. There was like 15% acreage, 15% less acres planted in 2023, but we still had more pounds of hops harvested, which is crazy. It just means yields went up, right? Yields was great for 2023. So not instead, like we're trying to pull plants out and reduce the production, but the yield just keeps going up, which is great. We're dealing with increased disease or increased disease pressure, but we have hops that have higher disease resistance. This is breeding and genomics, which we've talked about before. But yeah, there's a pretty big supply for hops right now. But we digress a little bit. There's a lot of hops that are out there sitting on shelves, but we're still using a lot of hops. I mean, Jordan, you're using 10 ounces in a 5-gallon batch of beer.
Well, at the dry hop, don't forget the whirlpool.
Of course, exactly. That still just sounds like such a crazy amount for me. But yeah, so usage of hops has changed, the hop availability, the type of hops. I mean, we have all these advanced hop products now that like you've been talking about, we've been talking about over the last few weeks. You've got Spectrum, you've got Incognito, you've got Lupulock, you've got, Euphoria, you've got Hop Kick, you've got all these new products that are always constantly coming out. And it's cool that we've got all of that. That's certainly changing. And Mr. Wizard certainly is getting a lot of questions about like, how do you use these hops? What about new hop varieties? We've Galaxy, burst on the scene from the New World over there in Australia and New Zealand. These are really new hops. But another thing too that Ashton was talking about was the haze craze, right? In the 90s, if you had haze in your beer would be poured out because it was unacceptable, that you had like totally unacceptable. And in fact, the mark of a good brewer was that you could brew clear beer and didn't have haze in it. And now we're trying to maintain haze. We're trying to get haze to stick into beer. And that's the other opposite end of the problem, right?
Yeah, and it kind of feels like it's going a little bit both ways for the homebrewing world, at least, in the sense of there's obviously this whole haze craze. But also, it seems that 20 years ago or so, homebrew clear was a thing, and it was like reasonably clear was good enough. I mean, not to mention bottling was more common probably 20 years ago than kegging is today. And now we've kind of come full spectrum and really want our beers to be as crystal clear as the pros. And we have the materials for them at the homebrew level, like Biofine, et cetera, to get it as really as crystal clear as, maybe a filtered beer might look.
Yeah, that's true, right? For a long time there, I'd say for 5 or 6 or 7 years, haze didn't matter. But I think we're certainly coming back to a time where haze does matter, right? I mean, I know that I'm certainly starting to see it in homebrewers that are trying to brew lagers and stuff like that. Lagers still should be clear, right? And I think it's a note of, or it's a feature of a good lager that it is actually clear, and so that still hasn't changed. But speaking of like lagers, this is one thing that he mentioned as well too was the styles have changed, and I point specifically to the IPA, right? I mean, the IPA didn't exist didn't exist as a popular brand or as a popular style back in the 1990s. I'm sure there may have been a few people out there that were brewing something like an IPA, but Ashton mentioned hoppy beers in the 90s were like Sierra Nevada style beers, right? They weren't dry hopped. There was maybe one or two brands that were actually dry hopping beers, but for the most part, it was just like all of your aromas coming from the boil kettle. We're not even doing this dry hopping thing. Then you add like the IPA, then we start dry hopping, and then we start whirlpooling, and then we start dip hopping and mash hopping, and holy moly, now we've got all these crazy new styles and uses for hops.
And given that, it makes me wonder if that's kind of partly why IPAs are so popular, is it's not a uniform brewing style. There's so many different things you could do. Look at just hazy IPA versus American IPA, Brute IPA, West Coast IPA. They're the kind of sub-styles alone have so many different brewing practices and ingredients associated with them. Then you get to these other leafers, like you said, dip hopping, etc. It really is a never-ending pursuit. Not to mention they just taste and smell really great when they're done well. And so it's really captured the attention of brewers, maybe arguably to our detriment, to the extent of other styles are now dying. The whole reason we got into this was to resurrect them. Amber ale, Irish red ale, you name it. You don't see that stuff anymore. And I'm guilty too. I don't go reaching for a brown ale when I'm at the grocery store or a pub.
Yeah, that's true, right? We see a lot of styles that have died, just as or are dying. I mean, I noticed that especially here in the Pacific Northwest, right? You and I, we walk into a bar or the grocery store, and we see like a lager or two on tap, and then 18 IPAs, right? And then I'm like, okay. That was a big change whenever I moved up here. I think, even in Texas, whenever I lived there, back in 2020, that was mostly lagers, right? And then a couple of IPAs and maybe one dark beer. And I mean, that could be a brown beer, that could be an amber, that could be a porter, it could be a stout, it could be anything, right? There's a huge range of dark beers, but it would just be one of those. So it'd be like 4 or 5 lagers, a couple of IPAs, and a dark beer. And, that's a change, right? I think that people were brewing ambers and browns and all that stuff back in the 90s and early 2000s, dark milds, all that sort of stuff. And that has been a a change. You mentioned the Brute IPA earlier, and another change that I'm seeing in home brewers is, it's related to this resurrection. It's the use of adjuncts. Right? Back in the 1990s, people were trying to get away from modern mass market beers. And that meant if a beer was brewed with adjunct, it was evil, and it can't be consumed. That sentiment, to me, I think still exists for some brewers, but it's mostly changed, especially in the home brewing community. I don't think people are afraid of using adjuncts like, corn in lagers or dextrose to make a Brute IPA, dry. I don't think people are as afraid of using adjuncts in beer.
Yeah, I don't think so at all. I think that boogeyman has pretty much died, and, simple sugar is a super common ingredient in American IPAs at this point. Not to mention, wheat is an adjunct, right? And you're using that in your hazies or your oats. At this point, all malt beers might be kind of, yesterday's news.
Yeah, true, right? I mean, and it makes sense, right? Like, we talked about this German versus Belgian brewing approach a few episodes back, and, Belgians have been using all kinds of ingredients. They've been using simple syrups and sugars and all that stuff for a long time, spices, everything to put in their beers, and they make fantastic beers. The Reinheitsgebot, is the one that, eliminated all the other things, right? That says it needs to be all malt. And there was sort of this infatuation in homebrewers of, the Reinheitsgebot. I have to brew a beer exactly, in this way, or it's not a craft beer. And I think, that's certainly changed. People are certainly willing to brew, with a range of ingredients. One thing also that kind of leads me to, I think, I don't know that this is necessarily true, but I might claim it as true on this podcast where nobody can challenge me except by feedback, is that I think Brülosophy had a lot to do with that. I think especially Marshall, right? Like Marshall talking all the time with me and you and other folks about how, well, maybe not you, but because you like the IPAs, but talking with other folks about how hey, I drink Miller Lite, Bud Light, and Coors Light. That's what I drink. That's what's in my refrigerator, right? Those light lagers, those American style lagers are in my refrigerator. And so I think that was a lot because there was no conversation. Nobody was talking about that when we were talking about that early on at Brülosophy, that light lagers are actually good and I like them and I want to consume them. But that's where I'm going with this. A long-winded way of going is that Brülosophy itself didn't exist 30 years ago. No one was doing experiments on a homebrew scale. Nobody was asking these questions, putting them through science, putting them through triangles, and testing all of these different brewing variables to see what makes a difference and what doesn't. That's pretty revolutionary, and Ashton himself mentioned that too. You've got his column where people are asking questions and he can sort of, respond and provide answers based on what he thinks and on his experience, and he can cite to research to the extent that there is, but nobody was out there, actually doing experiments except for until Brülosophy arrived, which has been a really big impact and really big change on the homebrewing industry.
Yeah, and I'm sure on the pro side too, that a lot of those experiments were pretty much exclusively done on light lager. And what might hold true for hopping rates in a light lager experiment, what have you, could be fundamentally different in an American IPA, let alone a, barrel-aged donut-infused imperial stout.
Yeah, barrel-aged donut-infused milk IPA stout or something. Black IPA. God. There we go.
What have we done?
Black lactose IPA. I'm sure somebody out there has done it before. But yeah, any event, so Ashton, of course, covered a lot of ground about what things have and haven't changed over the 30 years that he's been writing the Mr. Wizard column. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk about questions that still interest Ashton and also questions that still interest us. More Beer's slogan is absolutely everything for homebrewing, and it's easy to see why, given their selection of over 8,000 products, like the BrewBuild X3 Uniconical Stainless Steel Fermenter, or the Cosmos series of kegerators that give you everything you need to get started with dispensing and serving your homebrew. For quality fermentations, More Beer carries a variety of yeast and nutrients from the likes of Imperial Yeast, White Labs, and Cellar Science. More Beer offers free shipping on most orders over $59, and they also have a killer YouTube channel featuring brewing tips, hijinks, and awesome gear giveaways. Check out everything More Beer has to offer at morebeer.com.
Are you ready to launch your career to new heights? Visit careers.dish.com/technician now and uncover a world of exciting opportunities waiting just for you. From cutting-edge technology to a supportive work environment, Dish has everything you need to thrive. Don't wait any longer to kickstart your next opportunity. Apply today and join the Dish family where innovation meets opportunity. Visit us online at careers.dish.com/technician. Your future starts now.
Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals.
That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. And the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken experts since 1990. Chicken taco experts since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
I've been brewing for well over a decade as a home brewer, and I still feel like I learn something new every day. That's certainly one of the main takeaways from my interview with Ashton Lewis. Even after 30 years, there are still questions that interest him about beer and brewing. There's still new things to learn. Are there still questions that interest you, Jordan?
I think that's why we're here.
Right? That's probably the easiest question I've asked of anyone on the show.
It's amazing how much I rack my brain thinking about this stuff. And that's what's so amazing to be a part of the Brülosophy crew is my opportunity to actually do an experiment and dive into the heart of the question and be there, firsthand in person and taste the difference or lack thereof for myself.
Yeah. Exactly, right? Because, how many times do we see that where it's like, people post or comment and say like, oh, you had a pH of 5.6 versus a pH of 5.0, and, the gravity was 5 degrees Plato versus 1 degree Plato, and then tasters couldn't tell a difference. Well, that's just the crappy tasters that couldn't taste the difference. It's amazing the amount of people that can just say that confidently without actually having tasted the beer, right? And that's where it matters, right? When you get into the triangle test and you actually taste the beer, that's whenever some of this stuff really starts to be interesting to me. It's like, okay, it's not just me brewing the beer and having my own perceptions. This is 20 or 30 other people that we're serving these beers to under blind conditions, and they may or may not taste a difference. Some things matter and some things don't matter as much. And I always sort of find it interesting and chuckle a little bit that when dogma is challenged and that doesn't matter, that's whenever the most of those people come out like, oh, well, your tasters are just terrible, or obviously these were clear differences, that people should have been able to taste. But in any event, I digress. But that is one of the main things I love about Brülosophy. Like you said, we get to test this stuff and challenge it.
And it's amazing to see those kind of dogmatic beliefs manifest during a triangle test for a taster. Because I'll pour, 3 samples, 1 from draft line A and then 2 from draft line B, in immediate sequence. And, they don't see which cup is, getting filled from which draft line. And then they'll take the test and they'll get it wrong. And they'll swear that green tastes different than red or smells different than red. I'm like, dude, I literally just poured them from the same draft line. Yeah. And these are brand new clean cups. Like
exactly. There's something you did.
And yet bias is a bitch, and it's really hard to get over it. And even people that in the face of contrary evidence can really struggle to challenge a belief that they've created in that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, I mean, listening. That's again one of the cool things I like about Mr. Wizard's column. Is, even for somebody that's been brewing for 30 years, he's still out there reading all of the current research, right? And looking at like how things have changed. And so he's not just, whenever he's answering questions, he's not just spouting out the same dogma, right? That he's been that other people have been spouting out for 30 years. I think that's a challenge. As people get older, they get like sort of cemented into their brewing beliefs, and when that dogma is challenged, or when that brewing belief is challenged, it's hard for them to accept, right? Bias is a bitch, as you said. But that's, again, one of the things I love about Ashton's column is he doesn't seem to let that bias influence. He's very open to learning new things and then writing about those new things as they happen, which is fantastic. So questions that still interest Ashton. We started off the show kind of talking about this one, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it, Jordan. I mean, of course, we were talking about changing the pH during the mash. So let's say you did a 60-minute infusion mash and you started and had your pH at 5.2 or whatever. What if you actually changed the pH based on different enzyme optima? Or if you were doing a step mash, right? A protein rest, a beta amylase rest, and an alpha amylase rest. What if you were actually changing the pH during each of those rests to then maximize the activity of the enzymes, or maybe get some other enzymes to work? What do you think about that one? That was a pretty interesting question to me.
Yeah, that's getting pretty complicated. It's kind of nice that in some ways the mash is kind of an easier step in the brew day. You know, you mix your water, your grains, and your brewing salts, and you kind of leave it be for an hour or so. I'm kind of reluctant to find one more reason to complicate my brew day. But some examples that I've done of that is with the acid rest for a Hefeweizen, you'll often not add your lactic acid or sour gut or whatever you're using for your acidification agent until after that acid rest. I've heard that the optimal pH, is going to be different for those ferulic acid rests than it would be for like a beta or an alpha rest. The other example that I know of in that realm is the different pH concerns with mash hopping for unlocking thiol extraction. And so that is another example I've done in terms of altering the pH of the mash throughout the mash, as opposed to just like set it and forget it.
Yeah. I mean, I think of all those things too, right? And I think that would be really cool. But it kind of harkens back to that question, right? Like, what things haven't changed over the last 30 years. Like, a lot of people aren't really doing that. I mean, a lot of people aren't even measuring mash pH anymore at all, right? They're just kind of like letting it go. And that is a little bit, we've shown, through a bunch of different experiments, that mash pH doesn't seem to make a significant difference in the beers whenever they're actually taken all the way through to fermentation and served in a triangle test. I mean, how many experiments do we have on that? It's got to be at least a half a dozen at this point, where we've looked at different pH levels, and it just doesn't seem to make much of a difference, again, in a single infusion mash. So again, you've got this reliance on single infusion mashes, and that we've been doing. But it's something that would be interesting. That I raised that question at the beginning as, again, an example of like, this is things that, we can sort of say like, okay, maybe pH doesn't matter all that much, but then you change one thing, you change and you start talking about a different mash style, and suddenly maybe pH makes a big difference, right? Like you said, for the ferulic acid rest, for those Hefeweizens, maybe it makes a difference for the protein rest as we're going up in a step mash. And then, beta and alpha amylase, maybe we can get some additional extraction efficiency or clean up some of those other characteristics that we don't want, right? Like haze or something in beer. Maybe you could have a little bit better haze reduction or get thiols out of your beer. Anyway, I raised this as a question. Like these are questions that that people ask and that Ashton is still interested in pursuing. And one of the things that we talked about on the show was the influence of brewing scientists, right? This questioning nature of brewers and brewing scientists and how it influenced fundamental scientific research. We talked about like Kjeldahl, and we talked about like Hans Christian Hansen, like discovering the yeast cell, Pasteur discovering like, how to do pasteurization, all of these things that brewers discovered. Like, what are we going to be talking about in the future? And are we going to be talking about like Charles Denby from Berkeley Yeast and Laura Burns from Omega Yeast doing the first like GMO yeasts? Are we going to be talking about these people as like fundamental scientists in the future? It's kind of an interesting question.
Yeah, let's add Cade Job to that list.
Oh, I don't know. I'm a long way from that list. But maybe Tom Shellhammer. I mean, maybe we'll be talking about him, or maybe we'll be talking about, Charlie Banforth, or, any of these other people and their contributions to like, science outside of just the brewing industry.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like Ashton and Charlie are kind of the most immediate prior, vanguard of modern researchers. And now we have these kind of, uber modern researchers like Dr. Laura Burns, like you mentioned. And I think that is one of the most fundamental changes is the amount of science in our brews, all these little gadgets and gizmos and extracts and, enzymes. It's kind of crazy, the little laboratory I have in my basement relative to when I first got started. I mean, right. ALDC wasn't even available to homebrewers until recently. And things like we had to use gelatin because the more advanced fining products weren't available at the homebrew scale. All of that is changing, and I'm so grateful for, companies like Cellar Science to bring these really cool modifiers to the homebrew scale.
Yeah, totally. Right. I mean, and like you said, yeast used to be at the bottom of a container, but Imperial now goes through crazy, quality control measures to make sure that every batch of Imperial yeast comes out with 200 billion cells, right, at a pitch rate that makes sense for brewing. Right. You don't have to do a starter word. You can just literally pitch the packet of yeast. So you're right. We have all these technology innovations, and that's really interesting to think about, like how the science has changed. I mean, of course, over the Brew Lab, we've been doing this for 2 years now. Or 3 years now, the science has changed even in that 3 years. And so that was one of the things that Ashton and I also talked about, was this whole art versus science concept. And I liked Ashton's response, essentially saying that brewing is first and foremost a science, right? And that the art piece comes after. Once you understand those fundamental scientific aspects, then you can start to be creative. And that sounds a lot like what your opinion would be.
Yeah, I really like that because, you have to know enough to know which rules you can break when and how, right? And once you have a fundamental understanding of the science, is rudimentary as it might need to be, then you can really start to get creative, because otherwise you don't really know what you're doing. You don't really have a starting place, and you could just have a lucky accident or a big mess.
Yeah, right. A lucky accident or a big mess, and that's true, right? The true like sign of a master, right, is knowing like what levers you can and can't, or should or shouldn't pull, or what the likely outcomes would be from pulling a lever. But I do still think that the art plays a big role. I think you have to be creative, right? I think the artistic component of it is like, I want to brew a beer like this, in this artistic or creativity. How do I get there, and how do I do that? And that's where the science comes in, right? I mentioned the painter analogy, which I really like. Again, it's like a painter uses different brushes and brush textures and paints, and canvas and all that stuff to create art, right? The art itself is beautiful. The beer itself is beautiful and awesome, and that's what we're ultimately trying to create. But you're right, technology has changed. We have GMO yeasts now, right? We have a yeast that you don't even need ALDC. ALDC only became recently available to home brewers, but now we've got yeast that are available that don't even that you don't need. They produce their own ALDC, and so that the beer doesn't have to sit as long in the fermenter. You've got a yeast. We understand now the genes in yeast that are responsible for haze. That's a huge deal. Now which yeast, we can actually catalog the yeast into haze positive or haze neutral categories, right? Like if you use this yeast, your beer is going to be hazier than if you use this other yeast. And that has nothing to do with, flocculation or yeast in suspension. It's just this like yeast, protein polyphenol complex that yeast impacts.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy how far we've gone on both ends of the spectrum of a given issue, right? We haven't just resolved clarity. We're also resolving intentional turbidity. And so that's what's kind of cool, is that one solution or one question could actually open multiple doors.
Totally, yeah. And it seems like that always happens, right? One of the main things that brewers are looking at is raw ingredient quality, right? Everybody's been looking at that for as long as beer has been brewed. Everybody wants to brew with the best ingredient. I mean, heck, that's why the Reinheitsgebot exists, right? Because people were putting a whole bunch of other stuff in beer. And so they made this law that said, hey, you can't do this. Don't put wheat in there. Don't put other adulterants in there. These are the only ingredients that are allowed to be in beer. That's why it existed back in 1516. So that hasn't changed, but the raw ingredients themselves have changed, right? I mean, yeast is ostensibly at higher quality. Like you, I wasn't brewing 30 years ago, so I didn't experience the 90s and early 2000s of yeast quality. But Ashton certainly did, and other brewers have told us that they've experienced it. But even now, we're seeing raw ingredient changes like barley. We've talked about it before. Protein is increasing in barley as we deal with climate change, right? Heat, drought, and wildfires are causing protein to increase in barley. And that's going to be a challenge for brewers. I mean, Ashton himself said if he was designing a brew house today, he would not design it to do a single infusion mash. He would add a mash filter and a lauter tun. Because those are issues that we're going to start to see. You're going to start to see lautering issues with higher protein mash, higher beta-glucans, lower viscosity, higher viscosity, lower lautering efficiency. Those are issues that are coming with protein and the changes. I mean, we even talked about with Scott LaFontaine how rice is essentially not going to be super impacted because it likes heat, but barley is going to be impacted. Hops are going to be impacted. Raw ingredients are changing.
Right, and for better and for worse, because in some ways we've never had the variety that we can have access to on any of the ingredients, the number of yeast strains, the number of varieties of hops, the types of malt, the craft malt, the varieties, etc. But they're all facing, I guess at the very least on the hops and the malt side, their own environmental challenges, and so they're going to have to adapt. And it's a bit of a blessing and a curse because then yet more new products are going to come out.
So yeah, as we look at how raw ingredients are changing and as they change through, because of climate change related issues, we've also got this component where we're looking at breweries and home brewers going, hey, we need to find ways to go more green, right? We need to find ways to maybe do CO2 reduction or reduce energy consumption. I mean, you and I talked about how energy usage for like cold rooms and fermentation chambers and stuff is one of the key costs for the brewery, but also one of the things that could be contributing the most in terms of energy consumption is we're having to spend all this energy. The energy has to be produced, and depending on how it's being produced in your area, it might be leading to climate change. So these are all issues that we need to start thinking about, right? Like energy and going green. And that was one that Ashton mentioned as something that he still finds interesting. I know you find it interesting too, Jordan, because it's literally your job as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the most important things pressing the brewing industry at this time, really society and the world at this time, right? And it's up to all of us to really figure out how to make this world more sustainable, or we're not going to have one to live, breathe, and brew in going forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, several episodes back, we did a whole episode on like how to go sustainable or how to do a sustainability assessment in your own brewery, whether a home brewer or a commercial brewer. And I think that's a really, really important component as we talk about like how raw ingredients are changes. We also have to talk about our impact and the reasons why raw ingredients are changing. They're changing because of us, right? Because of the things that we're doing and humans' impact on the planet. That impacts, everything. It impacts the agricultural system and impacts access to water, all of this stuff as we go forward. But there's also some exciting future here too, right? As we look at like questions that still interest us, certainly GMO is something that really is interesting. And in the way of like, can we breed heat resistance into hops? Yes, we can. If we can learn and understand which genes are responsible for GMO, we may not necessarily use CRISPR to like chop it and add it in like gene editing, but we might be able to select plants that have those specific genetic markers that increase heat resistance, heat tolerance, disease resistance, such that maybe, for the case of barley, maybe we can breed heat resistance into barley where it doesn't see an increased protein as heat goes up. Maybe we can find some heat resistant barleys that taste just as good or that make just as good of a beer. And so we have a lot of options for the future too, as we're looking at this. Key being like GMO. And I was wondering about your thoughts, Jordan, on like, how much do you think GMO is going to play a role in the future of brewing?
I mean, as an armchair expert, I would guess it'd be pretty significant. And I'm, based on the kind of things that you're saying, that seems to be the case. But what I'm curious about is, what about AI and brewing? Because you hear a lot about that in every industry, but you're kind of on the bleeding edge of, brewing research. is it really being engaged with to the extent that we're seeing in other industries in brewing?
I think everybody wants to engage with AI. I think the question is how, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of us that don't have computer science degrees and, have like copious amounts of data, right? But don't know how to interact with the AI, right? Like, how do I take the leap? And that's where I think there's a huge opportunity for consulting in the brewing industry about AI opportunities. So if you're an AI researcher out there or like using AI in your daily life, that's certainly something that brewers are going to want to engage with a little bit more. But brewers have a huge amount of data. I mean, think about like, Jordan, you remember a few weeks ago, whenever we were looking at attenuation and we went through the Brülosophy experiments to see what the difference in attenuation was based on different variables. And like, that's not compiled anywhere, right? It's just like, it was us clicking through the individual experiments and writing down the differences in attenuation, right? I mean, what if you were able to use AI? We have a huge amount of data as Brülosophy. What if you could just dump all that information into the AI and say, okay, what things matter the most in brewing? Is it water chemistry? Is it hop? Is it dry hopping? What things matter the least in brewing, right? That'd be a kind of a cool like meta-analysis of Brülosophy that AI might be able to help with. But all brewers have that same information. Right, you've got temperature logs, and you've got pH, and you've got gravity changes, and you've got malt quality analyses, and you've got the actual outcomes of your wort and boil. Right, brewers are taking hydrometer readings all throughout the brewing process. They're taking specific gravity readings. They're looking at pH. They're looking at potentially microbes. They're looking at haze. They're looking at foam. They're looking at all of these things. Where's the meta analysis coming in? And I think all that is data that AI could really help with, right? Or even troubleshooting. Hey, my gravity dropped from this to this between these two batches. Where should I look, right? What do you think the problem is, artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, it seems that we're not too far from a world where big breweries are basically, robots brewing beer for us. They're, measuring everything constantly and refining and, micro adjustments to pitch rates and temperatures and, liquor to grist ratios, what have you, to the point where they're able to read every single little data point and find out what causes what and make, the best beer chemically and scientifically possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the big breweries especially, I'm sure, right, they're using inline monitors for all of this stuff, and they're tightly monitoring all of their process controls, their CO2, their consumption. Like, I'm sure if you looked at the amount of data that a big brewery had, it would be like, holy crap, that's insane, right? The amount of data that they have. And I'm sure they're doing mining of it, right? I'm sure as part of their research processes, they're looking back at that data and going, okay, yeah, this and this and this, and here's how we can improve the process, because I'm sure they're constantly doing that to try to improve. But yeah, could AI help there? Could AI help at a homebrew level? Steve Thanos did that I think it was Steve, right? Where it was Martin, where he asked ChatGPT to create a recipe and then brewed a beer that ChatGPT created, right? And then served it to like a master BJCP judge or a national BJCP judge. And the BJCP judge was like, yeah, it's great. It's a great example of the style that he brewed, right? I think you have, even as a homebrew level, hey, I don't know which hop might be best in this IPA. I want something fruity and tropical. What hop do you suggest? And the AI might be able to say, here, use this one.
Right. And so I think for the homebrewer, it can answer questions right now, but it's not actually collecting your water and milling in your grains, So that's kind of the beauty of homebrewing, is it gives us something in this overly technological world that we actually still get to do with our own hands.
Right. Well, and lest we forget, too, the robots aren't drinking the beer either, at least not yet. Right?
Yeah,
so it's us that are consuming it. And so you're still going to need humans to be able to taste and drink and consume the beer. So that was interesting. Another thing, too, we were talking about this, and this was an example of I asked Ashton, what are some things that you're like, what the hell? Why are people still doing this? Or why aren't people doing this thing? And he mentioned sieve tests on their mill. How many times have you gotten a question, Jordan, or have we gotten a question on Brülosophy that's like, I'm having efficiency issues. I've changed my mash temperatures. I've changed my mash pH. I've changed and tried different grains. I've tried boiling for less time, and I've tried doing all this other stuff, but I'm still not hitting my efficiency numbers. What's the answer, Jordan? What is the one thing that we always say? Look at this to hit your efficiency.
Right. The mill is really
right?
a critical issue here. And I guess it's tough when you're milling at a homebrew store from a website.
Yeah, exactly. Or from a website or from a homebrew store. The mill's a critical issue. And Ashton was saying he still walks into breweries and they say, hey, yeah, our efficiencies are kind of blah, blah, blah. And he goes, well, are you doing a sieve test on their mill? And they just stare at him going like, no, we're not measuring the grist size that's coming out of our mill. And, he was saying like this is kind of a larger issue. Brewers are focused on these things like mash temp and pH and such, but they're not focused on the size of their mill gap. Is that an opportunity where AI could sort of help with this stuff? Right. I mean, the AI is not going to be necessarily doing the sieve test, but maybe the AI is pointing out, hey, the mill gap is off. Right. Or you can start to get like alarms saying like, hey, what about systems like Brewfather with that data that's going in? You're putting all this information into Brewfather. You're putting your OGs, you're putting all this stuff into Brewfather or something like that. Could you add an AI component to that would be an AI troubleshooter? Like, okay, your last batch, you've had a trend over your last 4 batches that you've been consistently undershooting your target OG by XYZ. You should check your mill gap or something. That'd be pretty cool.
Right. This podcast is going to be, totally unnecessary soon enough.
Maybe. Yeah. Right. Like here's how you troubleshoot. Or that would be sad too, right? If the Help Me Mr. Wizard, didn't exist anymore. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, right? AI is still a long way off. I mean, the opportunities for AI are really cool and something that certainly is being explored everywhere, right? But we're not at the point where AI can do the things for us or brew the beer for us. Maybe we'll be there someday, but we are still quite a bit of time away from that. Well, Jordan, are there other things that still interest you or that you'd like to explore in the future with homebrewing, or did we hit most of them?
Oh man, no, it's never ending, and I wouldn't even know where to begin. So I'm excited to see where we land in the next couple weeks when the next thing that we'll apply the science on.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I'm excited to have spoken with Ashton Lewis and get his thoughts about how the brewing industry has and hasn't changed over the last 30 years. It's always awesome to talk to a homebrewing legend, and again, a commercial beer legend too. It's not like he's just a homebrewer. He works for BSG and as a faculty member at Siebel, and and has been is the technical editor of BYO. So this guy knows his stuff, which is great. So yeah, thank you, Ashton, for coming on the show, and Jordan. I guess you and I will be back in 2 weeks with our next Applying the Science episode. We'll see y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brülosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brülosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brülosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/Brülosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.